Are we getting to the point now where like the big clubs, like your Chelsea's, your super clubs, the ones who've got just money to burn for fun, like your Man Cities, your Chelsea's at the moment, your PSG's, do they even need to bother with scouts anymore? Or is it just a case of like their method of scouting is we'll let the smaller teams take the punts on these young players or these like sort of gems from out of nowhere, and if they end up being good in a year, we've got the money still, we'll just spend 100 million on them. What are we ever going to see? Because I think the point I made to Clates was like, because we were talking about the Liverpool Caicedo thing. Clates, a Liverpool fan, I was like, well, or Liverpool could just go out and find the next side. You go and find that sort of player for that sort of price, but rather than having to go out and spend 100 million on him after a couple of seasons. And I think Clay's point was, well, in the eyes of the club of that size, it's actually more of a risk to spend 4 million quid on an unknown player than it is to go and get someone who's more of a guarantee. Whereas I'm like, well, surely it's more of a risk to spend 100 million on him after a couple of years in the Premier League. I'll be interested. Obviously, you're a supporter of Man United, one of the biggest clubs in the country. I'd be interested to hear your take on it, especially Rasmus Højlund's just come in 70 million this summer. When.
I think the thing with it is this isn't a new phenomenon. This isn't like, oh, this has only just started happening recently. It's just the figures are higher. Like, it's always been a case of like Man United were the kings of it in the 90s and the 2000s of like, all right, who are the three players in the league that are better than anyone else and should be a better club? All right, we'll have them. We'll have Berbatov. We'll have Carrick. We'll have, and we'd do that. I was just say like, Rio Ferdinand and like bringing these kind of players through. Wayne Rooney, perfect example. Like, he's far too good to be there. We'll have him. As 40 million or 50 million or whatever the record was at the time. And other teams have done it as well. Like Liverpool used to do it, like Arsenal used to do it. There's been loads of big teams have kind of cherry-picked the best players from smaller clubs. And I don't think it's necessarily like they don't want to give young players a chance or bring young players through. I think it's just that, like Clayton said, like it's almost more of a risk to go, we're going to sign this guy for 4 million quid and maybe we'll see if he's any good. And one of the big things that Brighton have done really well, and it's not just Brighton that have done it, obviously, but I'll use them as a case in point. They'll take that 3-4 million quid outlay and then loan them out for 2 or 3 years to go and get some game time somewhere else. And it's when they come back is when they start to get good. So it's not just like they've signed a 3-4 million quid player and it's paid off. Like even the Leicester stuff, like with Kante and Mahrez, they signed them in the Championship where like there's a little bit less pressure to do it. You don't need to come in and hit the ground running. So there isn't that pressure to perform immediately. Whereas when you've brought a player in, given him the loan out, brought him back after a couple of years, like Alexis McAllister was the same. They signed him, loaned him out. And I bet there's untold amounts of players that they've done that with that haven't worked out.
Of course.
It's just there's 4 or 5 players that have. And Brighton have been the biggest kind of beneficiary of it recently. So I kind of look at it, though, like a player come through and then do it in a really good Brighton side where you can go, all right, yeah, we're going to spend a load of money on him, but he's got it. Whereas you could try and scattergun 10 players for that and have a 0% hit rate because you don't have the development or the pathway to get to the first team.
I think it's interesting. You mentioned like Arsenal, like you said, like obviously United used to do it, and obviously City do it now, and like Arsenal, you say Arsenal used to do it. But I guess I look at Arsenal, like even back in the Wenger days, they went and found Patrick Vieira. Like no one had heard of it. Obviously, different times, right? Not English fans didn't really know much about anything of like players overseas unless they were playing in like Italy or Spain at the time. But they went and found Patrick Vieira, like for like. I know again the fees are obviously not comparable nowadays, but not as relative maybe.
Arsenal are Patrick Vieira, definitely, because
and like even recently, right? Gabriel Martinelli was sort of plucked out of the Brazilian second division or third division, something like that, and now he's like one of the best wingers in the league. And it's like I know the hit rate's not always there, but I do wonder if like, and I guess like you could maybe argue City have done it with Alvarez, but I think everyone knew of Alvarez anyway, just mainly because of Football Manager. But Alvarez was already a name coming through. But like, I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm not comfortable with just seeing clubs just go, oh, I'm just going to chuck 100 million there, 100 million there, sort of thing. Like, there's a little bit more of a romanticism when a club picks a player out from like obscurity and they turn into like, a world beater. It just doesn't really seem to happen with the bigger clubs anymore. Is it maybe, like you said, maybe it was just Arsenal or the outlier, and that's what sort of clouded my thoughts on it.
I think as well, it's very dependent on how quickly you need them to be the guy. Yeah, like if. Like Liverpool, for example, they've got Bajcetic as a young DM, and that's it. Like they need someone to come in and be the guy. So you need someone that, even though they might be really young, is proven. They might have only had 1-2 good years, but they're more proven that it's like who can handle the pressure of Premier League, or elite football. Whereas again, if you go out and buy a 18, 19-year-old kid for 4 million quid and go, there you go, go be our defensive midfielder in front of this defense that doesn't defend. Like, and it's going to be your fault when we concede goals.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So like, you can kind of weigh it up in a couple of different ways. And that being said, like, for all the big money that Chelsea have spent on like established players and good, they have picked up a few guys who are pretty cheap. Like there was a couple of, like a midfielder that came on, or a left back that came on at the weekend who was like, "Who's this guy? I've never heard of him." And it's like,
I know what you mean, yeah.
8 million quid from France. And he's now in the Chelsea first team. All right, okay. Well, maybe there is that kind of thing, but they're going to be fed in from underneath rather than fed to the dogs straight away. And to be fair, United have done it. United have done it with a couple of players. There's Pellistri who's now kind of getting game time. He came off the bench and looked pretty lively. We had Ahmad. I mean, we spent a decent whack of cash on him, but he's been out on loan, proving himself. You got young players coming through that have been signed for that. It's just they don't want to be thrown straight in at the deep end. Like Dallo was that. We signed him as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, and he's been out to Italy and Portugal on loan, and he's like 23 now, and he's starting to blood himself into the first team. I don't think he's the same level as a Casado or anything like that, but there are teams that try and do it. And it's like I say, I think it's just the pressure that's on it. I think it's easier to do it at a Brighton than it is a Liverpool or a Man United.
Yeah, I see that. And I guess the more money in football now, the less risk you can take, really. Just because of the stakes are so much higher, right? Especially for the traditional big six or big seven, whoever.
Yeah, and I think as well, like if one of those big teams are going to give a kid a chance in the first team, I think you're always better weighted trying to give it to someone who's come through the academy rather than someone you've signed at 18, 19 years.
Yeah.
Like, because you'll get a bit of leeway from the fans. Like they've come through the system, they understand it a little bit more rather than signing an 18-year-old, chucking him in the first team. Even if you bring him in like as a foreign youngster and bring them in, like Garnacho is a really good example. I picked him up for a few $100,000 as a 15-year-old or something. He's come through the academy, but because he's from the academy, like the fans will give him a bit of extra leeway and like allow the odd bad game. It's like, oh well, he's just a kid, he's giving it a go. Whereas if you sign someone like that, we'll be going, why have we signed this 18-year-old kid when there's 18-year-old kids in the youth academy?
Yeah, no, it's a fair point. It's a fair point. You can consider my opinion swayed. Yeah. You win this round, Clates.
Damn you.
He's done it again.